Bristol is one of the UK's most culturally and economically significant cities. Yet its public transport network doesn't reflect that. The city has no underground, no trams, and not even a rail link to the airport, and this manifests in its car ownership rates, which, for a major British city, are unusually high. So how and why did this come to be, and is there anything we can do to change it? Bristol's transport history is checkered. Whilst the city initially wanted to build a publicly owned tramway, a financial crisis meant that it was the private sector that succeeded, with Bristol gaining one of the largest private networks in the country. However, it didn't take long for Bristol City Council to regret their decision, and by the 1890s public ownership was back on the cards. As a result, after a short burst of electrification in the early 1900s, the private sector naturally became reluctant to invest in the tram company, one with a seemingly uncertain future, and there were very few tramway expansions after the turn of the century. Equally, the city still didn't own the trams, so there was no investment from the public realm either. When the tramway's power station was bombed in World War II, by which time the city had finally decided to take control of the network, buses had become the dominant provider of public transportation, and rather than repair the power station, the city decided to close the entire tram network down. After the war, it was cars that were at the top of the transport hierarchy, and large portions of the city were demolished to make way for them. But when plans developed for a ring road through some of Bristol's wealthiest suburbs like Clifton and Redland, public protests suddenly became much more visible, and the plans ground to a halt. But a huge amount of construction and demolition had already been done, and Bristol was scarred with motorways. At the same time, Bristol's few suburban railways either had their capacity slashed or were removed completely. Nonetheless, though, Bristol still gained a perhaps uniquely independent identity in the second half of the 20th century, with movements like the Bristol bus boycott helping to dismantle racial discrimination on public transport, and graffiti artists like Banksy built up a vibrant cultural scene. In 2012, this independence was carried over into governance too, and a directly elected mayor was introduced to the city. The two mayors since then, George Ferguson and Marvin Rees, have attempted to address the poor state of public transport in Bristol, often working in partnership with the West of England Combined Authority. So now, in 2024, after numerous projects, what does Bristol's transport network look like? And is it any good? The dominant method of transport in Bristol is still buses. Most buses are operated by First Bristol, who, in my opinion, actually do a very good job. Their vehicles are generally smart and reasonably modern, and many routes have attractive route branding. In particular, the red city lines look stunning. I also love how a lot of their drivers are part-time. In other words, to help ease the crippling driver shortage, First have been hiring all sorts of drivers to only operate a few hours a week. This is brilliant, and I wish it was done more often. It allows people to top up their wages whilst also filling vacancies. However, the part-time drivers don't seem to be issued with uniforms, so it can look a little odd to see a driver turn up in a t-shirt. But speaking of uniforms, full-time drivers certainly look the part. The various routes and their frequencies do seem relatively sensible, but I'm not overly familiar with them, so do let me know if you have any specific comments. However, as with basically any British city, orbital connections could do with a bit of work. You almost always have to go into the centre and then out if you want to go around. Recently, the conventional bus network has been supplemented by a series of Metrobus routes. These are express bus rapid transit lines, which see buses get priority at traffic lights, dedicated bus lanes, and supposedly improved bus stops. Though, in reality, they're not actually that much better than the existing ones. You're not allowed to buy a ticket from the driver on Metro buses. You can only use tap on, tap off, or buy a ticket from the iPoint ticket machines at bus stops, which speeds up boarding and removes the uncomfortable social interactions that you usually subject yourself to when travelling by bus. All jokes aside, I think the ability to buy a ticket before getting on the bus at the bus stop is a huge factor in improving confidence of uncertain passengers. It gives them a little bit of peace of mind, whereas if they're forced to board a bus before buying a ticket, they can't exactly back out if they decide it's too expensive. The Metro bus routes themselves are numbered from M1 to M4, with lowercase m's for some reason, and each route has its own colour. I love the colour coordination and naming system, but the branding as a whole really falls flat. It's so drab. Why are the buses grey? Don't misinterpret me, I do love a grey bus if done well, but the Metro buses are just covered in a single uninspiring shade that's really lacking in visual interest. Internally, they're not much better either. The interiors are equally bland and miserable, and whilst the seats aren't that bad, they're certainly not the most comfortable I've ever travelled on. Now yes, this is nitpicking to a degree, but it's not like it's a difficult problem to solve. Take a look at the City Lines buses that I mentioned before. They're exactly the same vehicles, with exactly the same seats, but the colour palette is much more appealing. The Metrobus experience more than makes up for these minor issues, though. The routes seem thoughtfully designed, and you really feel like you're moving places quickly, and that psychological speed is arguably just as important as physical journey time. Bus lanes have been put in as and where appropriate, so you can nip past traffic just when you need to. It is rather satisfying to fly past queues. Now, these bus lanes are one of the main benefits of building the Metrobus instead of, say, a tram. With a tramway, only the trams can use it, obviously, but bus lanes aren't limited to just Metrobuses. Any service can make use of them, boosting reliability and reducing journey times. Some sections, though, especially on the M2, are specific to Metrobuses. They use guided busways and follow an entirely separate right-of-way. It's a little bit like a railway, except much worse. Whilst the high tractive effort of buses means they're able to climb very steep gradients, and the reduced regulation surrounding road construction means they're far cheaper to build than a rail line, I struggle to see the point. In theory, busways take up less space than a conventional road, as there's no need to account for steering errors. But in practice, there are hardly any locations where the few centimetres saved are really needed. I can't find an actual figure, but anecdotally buses on the M2, the only route with a proper guided busway, seem to run faster just on plain old roads. So I'm not sure why this sort of gimmicky technology is preferable to just building a dedicated road for buses. Perhaps the most confusing thing about Metrobus, though, is its staggering upfront cost. And no, I'm not talking about the tickets. They're pretty reasonable and are included in a standard bus day pass. I'm instead talking about the £230 million this scheme costs to implement. That's not much less than a light rail line, and for only a few miles of new road and bus lane, that's really quite a hefty price tag. Now, don't misinterpret me, this is still better than nothing. But is this really £230 million worth of transport improvements? For context, the entirety of Greater Manchester is seeing its buses come under public control as part of the integrated B network for just £135 million. My point is not that Bristol should have copied Manchester and franchised their bus routes too, but rather that the Metrobus doesn't really represent particularly good value for money. Unfortunately, there isn't much rail-based transport to fall back on in Bristol either. There's one branch line, the Severn Beach line, and the main lines in and out of the city do have some local trains. Most notably, the line north out of Bristol to Bristol Parkway recently saw widening to 4 tracks, enabling more local services to run. Yet despite this, the frequencies certainly aren't overwhelming. Even the busiest core section north of Bristol only sees 3 trains per hour for a few stops, and that's not even regular. Trains leaving Lawrence Hill for Bristol Temple Meads, for example, leave at 2, 12 and 39 minutes past the hour. Yet this is the main thoroughfare. Once you get out into the branches, things get much worse. The Severn Beach line only sees 2 trains an hour, again irregularly, and only one of those goes all the way to Severn Beach. The line is largely single track, and journeys along it are very slow. For a major city in one of the most developed economies in the world, it's really not good enough that the main suburban rail lines look like this. Not a single one is electrified, and they all use slow, dirty, old and uncomfortable diesel multiple units. Indeed, not even the intercity mainline from London has wires. This is really unacceptable. But of course, there were plans to remedy this last issue. They were just cancelled to save money. Apparently, the West of England Combined Authority would like to electrify the main lines themselves with their own money, but I have my doubts as to if this will actually happen. I'd love to be proven wrong, though. Okay then, if I'm not satisfied, then what would I do to improve things? Well, I think most potential lies in rail transport. With most bus services being under one operator, First Bristol, and them doing actually a pretty good job, I don't think there's a particularly pressing need to alter their setup. Obviously, it's not perfect, but I'm not really familiar enough with the area to suggest any specific improvements to routes. However, there does feel like a lot of potential for bus priority to be expanded. There are a number of roads where there's space. Wells Road, for example, has plenty of room for a bus lane if you were to get rid of on-street parking, which is pretty limited as is. A handover of some stagecoach routes to first Bristol and the outer parts of the city might also be a good idea. Yet there is only so much you can do with buses. Before the pandemic, Bristol had already seen huge passenger growth, and traffic congestion has shown no sign of improvement. Meanwhile, there are railway corridors lying underutilised or just plain disused. The line west to Portishead is nearly completely intact, and a small section is still used for freight, but there are no passenger services. Fortunately, there are supposedly ambitions to reopen the line as part of the Metro West project. Now, don't be confused, Metro West isn't anything like the South Wales Metro, say. It's not a metro system, it's just a series of rail improvements to suburban lines around the city. And sadly, those improvements aren't exactly spectacular. The reopened Portishead line, for example, will only have one train an hour and won't be electrified. Whilst Metro West doesn't quite cut it, I think there's huge potential for a London Overground or South Wales Metro sort of service within the city limits. Electrification, double tracking, and trains at least every 15 minutes would certainly reinvigorate these poorly used lines. Obviously, new trains are needed, and ticketing should be integrated with buses, though it already is to some degree. But I'm in two minds as to whether these suburban services should retain their GWR brand or instead gain a new Metro West identity. I'm actually leaning towards the former. The Great Western Railway and Isambard Kingdom Brunel himself have an important place in Bristol's history and are already recognisable and honoured in a sort of Bristol mythology. And I think it would be a shame to lose this cultural identity. But both Bristol City Council and the Mayor are correct to point out that Bristol needs more than just improved railways. It needs an entirely new system. There has been much controversy over what this system should be, though. Some have argued for an underground, others for trams, and both sides have good arguments. An underground would clearly make the most sense for the dense and growing city, but it would be extremely expensive, possibly costing as much as £18 billion. And is it really realistic to expect this to get funding? Theoretically it should be. London's Elizabeth line cost £18.8 billion, and that was overlaid on top of an already extensive transport system. But it would require a major cultural and political shift for Westminster to suddenly start forking out sums of money this large for transport outside of London. And it would naturally lead other cities with a desperate need for better transport like Leeds to ask why they can't get some money too. There isn't really a simple answer to this, other than that they also deserve funding. But it's difficult to see any government going down this avenue in the foreseeable future. As a result, I think light rail might be more likely to get off the ground. A good proof of concept, if you will be to follow the alignment of the old Bristol and Bath Railway, which is now used as a cycle path. Putting a tramway alongside the path would be relatively cheap, and the trams could run on street in the city centre. High-floor trams, like the ones used in Manchester, would be ideal, as these do retain a train-like quality when they're on their own right of way. There's plenty of choice for entirely new lines, though. Bristol has a lot of so-called transport deserts, not least the airport, which should get a rail connection with some urgency. In these cases, I think an underground is the only real choice. There's just no room for a tram. That said, the underground could be a form of German Stadtbahn or Belgian pre-metro, where, essentially, trams run in tunnels, and then use the theoretical new on-street tram tracks in the city centre that were provided as part of the Bath and Bristol Railway. This would be worse than a full underground, but it would save a little bit of money, as tunnelling under city centres is not cheap. Honestly though, perhaps the most transformational change would be a relatively minor one, that of local authority boundaries. Bristol has sprawled to the extent that large parts of what are effectively the city are technically outside its boundaries, like Patchway, Stoke Gifford, Emerson's Green, or even Yate. Whilst the latter's probably a little too far out, expanding the city region would enable Bristol City Council to operate a far more coherent transport strategy across the entire urban area. It doesn't take a genius to look at this admittedly rather simplistic heat map of the Bristol area to see that the City Council does a far better job at minimising car use than surrounding local authorities, especially South Gloucestershire. This isn't exactly surprising when you look at Gloucestershire's planning. And it's not even like this is an unfortunate legacy of the past. They've been getting worse. Now, some of their new developments are better than others, but with the possible exception of Brabazon, they're all still primarily focused around the car, and this is going to be a difficult habit to break for any authority, yet I'm certain that Bristol City will have more luck than South Gloucestershire. Again, the proof is in the pudding. All in all though, it is absolutely vital that something gets built. Bristol has an educated population, and business is flourishing in the city, bringing a level of prosperity that's comparable, in some areas, to London. However, potential further growth is being constrained by an extremely damaging housing crisis, and traffic congestion will likely make the city less attractive for businesses in the future. But if a concerted effort is made, backed up with adequate funding, Bristolians could feel huge benefits, and it will no doubt be worth the price tag.